Well, welcome everybody. We'll go through some housekeeping quickly. You can have your video on or off, and the host has muted all attendees. We will have questions at the end of the presentation, and then this setting will actually be removed, so you'll be able to ask your questions. The presentation component of this event will be recorded, and if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat area to enter them. You will have a chance to ask them yourself at the end of the presentation. Please wait until we open up the question time though. If you want to speak, you will need to raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol so that we can be fair to everybody. And once you've asked your question, please make sure that you lower your hand by clicking on the hand symbol again. Note, the question time will not be recorded. So now what I'd like to do is just introduce Alex, our speaker for today. So we're very privileged to have Alex Schellenberg, a Varroa Development Officer, who is based in the state of New South Wales to present our second event, Video Alternative Hives Varroa Meeting. There will be other staff from the National Varroa Mite Management Program as well online to assist Alex throughout this presentation. This meeting came about because I'm a non-Langstroth hive owner, and not knowing how to manage treatments if I wanted to use treatments in my alternative hives. As often supers can't be removed from these types of hives, they are integrated. So the Department of Primary Industries and the National Varroa Mite Management Program and the Varroa Development Officers are bringing this event to you tonight. Alex hails from British Columbia, Canada, and before working across the globe, firstly in New Zealand, where he helped to produce Manuka honey as well as queen rearing, then moving on to Australia. With a passion for queen rearing and 10 years beekeeping experience, Alex now has 30 hives in Maitland, New South Wales.
Excellent. Hey, everyone. I will just jump into the presentation. I know the time's going to be a bit tight. So let's share that. My name is Alex Schellenberg. I'm a Varroa Development Officer. I'm going to be going through this presentation. It typically takes quite a bit of time, about 2 hours or so, to do the whole thing. We won't have time for all of that. I'll try to really push it down to 45 minutes and share the parts that are really important for people with alternative hive designs. It's my phone number listed there. That'll also be at the end. I'll run through the slides fairly quickly, and if anything is missed or if anyone wants to read it, they might have to go back and view the recording of the session. So I'd like to start the day by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which with we gather, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend those respects to the First Nations peoples here today. So September 19th, for various reasons, Varroa was declared to be endemic in New South Wales and in Australia, and the shift was from eradicating the mite to learning to live with it, learning to manage it. So the control order was removed, and Varroa in European beehives is still a notifiable pest for all of those who manage beehives. So I'm a Varroa Development Officer, and we work in the capacity of kind of more in the education space. We're teaching beekeepers skills and knowledge to be able to raise their abilities to being able to manage Varroa in their hives and maintain their hives year to year, trying to not see the devastating hive losses that other countries in the world have seen when Varroa first hit their shores. This is just a quick list of all of the New South Wales videos and a contact number for the New South Wales video team. So, understanding the mite. Without the bees, there won't be any mite. It is a parasite. and it breeds within the brood of the mite. So that, or within the honeybee. And that makes it particularly difficult to address because very few treatments will actually penetrate into the brood to be able to kill the mite. Once it gets in there, it's in there. You'll never be able to get 100% of them out, and it will continue to grow. And you only need one mite to infest a hive for the whole hive to eventually become full of it. As you can see in this graphic, you have one mite hops off of the bee and goes into a larval cell. And over the span of that brood cycle, you get up to 3 mites from a worker and 5 off of a drone that come out. So the growth is exponential and can be quite aggressive. So Varroa's life cycle can be seasonal, as honeybees' life cycle is seasonal. They go through phases where they build up and drop off. And that population period is just slightly offset of what the honeybees population would be. In Australia, we won't necessarily have the dormant stages that we see here. And that's because many places in Australia just won't have the cold to shut down the bees, and they'll still have sources in the winter. And so the population could just be a constant kind of increase with a slight decrease and just increasing, which would make it quite difficult. A lot of the information that we have collaborated is from either North America or New Zealand or Europe, and those conditions are going to be totally different. So it's going to be a learning curve for all of us. And from what we've seen so far, it can be quite difficult, but there is hope. So the natural host of Varroa was the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. And just the way that they've developed with Varroa, you can see there that the gestation period for the brood is a lot shorter. And because of that, the Varroa really only build up in the drone population, because that's just long enough for them to be able to reproduce. But that's pretty much the same as the European honeybee's worker brood. And so, yeah, you get a lot faster buildup because there's so many more worker brood cells than drone cells in your average hive. And that's what makes it particularly bad for the European bee to have this pest. Currently, Varroa populations throughout Australia are wildly unstable. We have huge amounts of feral populations that will be harboring the various amounts of Varroa mites that can reinfest managed hives. And so reinfestation will be a common occurrence and will be something that beekeepers have to keep their ducks in a line to be able to monitor where the health of their hive is at any one time. And obviously, the higher the infestation rate, the faster the damage of the hive. The fastest that we've seen in the field, there was a hive in Sydney where beekeeper did an alcohol wash, had 0 mites noticeable in the hive. There might have been some there, but it just wasn't detectable in an alcohol wash. And within 66 days, the hive had died. And they were kind of scratching their head and wanted someone to come out and verify what had happened there. And best we could see, it was Varroa that had done that. Here you have a graph on the potential infestation rate. This is modeled just after one mite getting into a hive and reproducing, based on the average colony size of about 30,000. So you can see it's not even detectable until about 11, 12 weeks. And then we can start to actually see, oh, there's an infestation here, but that happened 2-3 months ago. And yeah, it just takes, again, a single foundress to be able to infest a hive. If there's a hive that is weakened from Varroa and a managed hive goes to rob that out, they could start this graph not on 1, but on 50 or 100. And so the growth can happen very, very quickly. once Varroa is in an area, established in an area, or close to established in an area, it's really important to keep that monitoring up. The recommendation was 16 weeks. That's really not sufficient. Once Varroa is kind of close, knocking on the door, it should be monthly. No, monitoring for Varroa. It's really critical to get an early detection so that you can have enough time to plan what you're going to do to address the threat of mites in a hive. Just looking at bees coming and going, or even opening the hive and looking at bees, is not really a good way to determine whether or not mites are there. As you can see in that photo, it's nearly invisible. You wouldn't necessarily see that on a bee. And so actually doing the washes, doing the monitoring is one of the easiest ways to detect the mite in a hive. Again, we were talking about doing that regular monitoring. It should be every month once you feel like the threat of Varroa is in the area. So we have a dynamic heat map that people can respond, put their alcohol washes on. It's important to report negatives as well as positives because it gives us an accurate idea of what's going on in the state. The three methods that we're recommending people use is an alcohol wash, a soapy water wash, and a sugar shake. All three are equally valid for doing monitoring, so long as they're done properly. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the sugar shake. It's effective for monitoring mites, just as effective as the alcohol or the soapy water wash. It's less lethal. We've had Biosecurity Officer Sam Giggins. He did a quick test where he marked 300 bees for the sugar shake, did his sugar shake, put it in a hive, and had roughly 16% die. And that's just a one-off test, but 16% had died. And the thought is some of the icing sugar may have gotten into their spiracles and slowly suffocated them. So this was over the span of 16 hours that he noticed this mortality. Sugar shake's also quite sensitive to humidity. Obviously, it's sugar. It clumps, and if it's clumping, it's not going to coat properly. And you really want the little sticky pads of the mite to get coated so that they are easier to come off. They don't have such a strong grip. It doesn't necessarily kill the mite in the sample, so you have to be careful about that. Typically, people shake it over a jug of water to get the result, to see it. So the drowning will kill it. But just thinking that, if I shook the mite and you can tap the bees back in without actually clearing the mites out, might still just reinfest that hive with what was in that sample. It requires a little bit more time, about 2 or 3 minutes of manual agitation on that sugar shake, and a little bit more equipment with the tub of water and what have you. So for choosing a frame, this is going to be the same for any monitoring method you use. You're going to want to find a frame that's similar to this with open brood. That's going to, the open brood is a bit of an attractant to the mite. It's going to have a lot of nurse bees coming to it, and that's the bee that you really want. They're going to have the most contact with the larva. They're going to be coming into that area as much as possible. So you find a open cap brood, shake them into a bin or into a collection method, or brush them off if you're using something that doesn't have obviously solid ridges like a top bar hive. You would want to get a brush out and brush the bees off to try and get that half cup sample of about 300 workers. Half a cup is about 300 workers for what we're doing, and give them that agitation with the sugar, and that would have enough time to let the mites drop off. For threshold, we're talking about 5 mites or more. You're going to want to look to controlling Varroa in that hive, and that's in the spring and the autumn when the population's bigger. Once you have 9 mites or so, you're going to want to be looking at controlling that hive. controlling Varroa in that hive. So key points to monitoring here is, if you don't need to treat, don't. You're just throwing extra money into something that you don't necessarily need to at that moment. Obviously, throwing more miticides or throwing more things into the hive increases potential residue buildup in the wax. And over a longer period of time, if treating unnecessarily, could create a bit of resistance to the treatments that we have available. Putting treatments in a hive when mites haven't been established yet won't also keep mites out of the hive. It's very likely that something will sneak through that barrier system still. And again, all it takes is that one mite. So selecting bees from open brood, collecting the 300, and manually agitating it for the proper amount of time. Sticking with one method, whatever you're comfortable with, and just hammering that consistently will give you really good results. And these monitoring methods work for all varieties of hives. This is a quick QR code for some videos on how to do those monitoring methods. And then I want to talk about an example that we had out in Cessnock here. So this was a sample that we had from about 300 bees. And this was one of the first hives that we had that was very severely affected by the mite that we noticed. Go through some of these slides. We also used a sticky mat and recovered a few thousand mites in the first couple of days of the treatment that we put into that hive. So outside the front of the hive, we noticed a lot of ejected dead pupae and adult workers crawling on the ground. There was a lot of lethargy with the adult population of the bees as well. In the hive, we noticed a lot of perforated cappings, a lot of open cells, and a lot of, like you can see, pupae just hanging out the fronts. We had a lot of sunken cells, a lot of what looked like AFB or EFB symptoms. We did slides to determine if there was EFB or AFB present here as well, and they came back negative. So this was just from the stress of that larva dying while it was in the cell. Population of the bees wasn't strong enough to keep up with cleaning those cells out. And the cells, the larva can also look a bit twisted, look quite sunken. And this was all just from mite pressure. One of the signs that you would see if mites are established in a hive, especially at high levels, is what's called Varroa frass, and that would be the waste from the reproduction, and they often defecate in the cells. Sometimes they'll defecate on the larva as well, but you can see those white little specks that are on the sides of the cell, and that would be the Varroa frass. Obviously, opening up a cell, and if you saw Varroa in there, would be a definite indicator on what's going on. And also, if you do see mites on a bee, especially multiple mites, then that's an extreme example of a mite infestation. We have some other detection methods that can be used, not for determining treatment thresholds, but just to determine whether or not mites are present or absent in a hive. One of them is drone brood uncapping, and that's where you get a fork, an uncapping fork, and you just poke it into the brood and gently lift them up, and looking underneath and in between all of the drone brood there to see if there are mites running around, and sometimes they'll be in the cells looking there. If you're going to use this method, you'd want to also uncap about 100 cells to get a good indicative picture of what's going on in that hive. Another option would be the use of a sticky mat if people are using vented floorboards or open floorboards, open entrances underneath the hive. It could be that there's a certain percentage of the mite that will drop and will fall onto the sticky mats. So even without miticide use, there will be a percentage that fall naturally. And obviously with miticide use, it's just an indication of the treatment's efficacy there. Some people might be familiar with Varroa fly, so just a picture side by side, understanding that the pests do look similar, but very distinctly different. Now we're going to go on to using integrated pest management to control the Varroa. We have a cultural, mechanical, and a chemical. And as we go through, you'll see that there are different levels for different stages and infestation levels. So cultural very much relies on requeening with resistant or tolerant stock currently not available in Australia. There's splitting hives up to break the brood, and it interrupts the growth rate of the Varroa, and yeah, giving brood interruptions. So we have tolerance and resistance. These Varroa hasn't been in Australia long enough to determine whether or not the wild stock or the managed stock has tolerance or resistance traits, but internationally there have been a few that have been identified. But these traits are lowly heritable, meaning they get lost pretty easily if they're going through natural breeding. They're really hard to select for, and yeah, within a couple of generations could be very easily lost or diluted. At this time, it's illegal to import stock that could be proven to have this Varroa hygiene, mostly for certain viruses and diseases that we don't have that are quite nasty in beehives, like deformed wing hasn't yet been confirmed to be present in Australia. And if we can keep that out, that would be an amazing thing for the beekeeping culture. Some of the other ones are kind of a hygiene where they detect stress in the pupae and remove and uncap those distressed pupae to stop the Varroa from continuing to grow. Forcing brood breaks like requeening or creating splits in a colony, making a new colony, can give the colony a bit of a break in dealing with the Varroa in the cells, because all of the brood will all of a sudden hatch out, and they'll have a bit of a break where everything's phoretic, or all the Varroa is out on the actual population of bees. So it will slow that growth curve. It doesn't necessarily deal with the mite exactly, but it will slow that growth curve a bit and give people a bit of time to actually treat, if that's what's called for. Can be done by queen caging. So when a brood break occurs, using a treatment would be incredibly effective, because it would mean that now all of the mites are available for treatment. Requeening, splitting will also do that. And swarming at this time should be minimized, just to limit the amount of wild hives that are building up. Again, any unmanaged hive is going to be one that will become essentially a mite bomb, and will become a ticking time bomb of Varroa that will reinfest managed hives. There are quite a few mechanical control methods that can be used. One of them is adopting some kind of mesh or screen for ventilation, but also for allowing Varroa mite to drop through the bottom. If it's, for instance, like a top bar hive, you could have that bottom structure be mesh, or water hive could also have some kind of mesh bottom. There's a few other alternative hive styles, but I think any of them could essentially have a section, or even the entire bottom of it could be this mesh to allow mites to drop. And again, they will just naturally drop, and doesn't replace a treatment, but it may space out time between the treatments. You can use it with a sticky mat, but that's not 100% necessary. Drone trapping has been one method that people have used that's been incredibly effective at slowing the growth and really reducing mite loads in a hive. And that involves placing frames that encourage the bees to produce lots of drones, whether that's a full depth comb, a split frame, or even just an undersized frame. The queen will lay it out with drones, and Varroa has a preference to drones, quite a strong preference to drones. So if we can capture that before the drones hatch, could cut it out or freeze it, uncap the drones, and then reuse it. These can be adapted quite easily for alternative hives. There are not plastic. Well, there are plastic foundations, but there's also wax foundations that are sized perfectly for drones, and the bees will draw those out and be used for drones. Plastic frames can be modified to fit any variety of hive size. And again, you can just find any frame that has damage. Typically, the bees will draw that out with drone cells in the repair, and we'll have a drone cell preference on that frame. If you have a frame like that that's over, let's say, a half of drones, that could be used for this method as well. Just keeping a record of when it was placed in, and then counting 20 days, taking it out, putting it in a freezer, killing those drones, killing those mites in a freezer, and then you can give it back to the bees. They'll clean it up, and away we go. That's been used by the people at Tocal to keep mite loads from really spiking during summer and delaying treatments. So there was a spring treatment and an autumn treatment done in the Tocal hives, and drone trapping was used in the interim. Obviously, it can only be used when the season's right, and obviously, if the drone frame is taken out after 20 days and the drones start hatching, you're now getting those exponential growth of Varroa. So it is, yeah, good record keeping is essential for this method. Another method that's becoming a little more aware of is the heat treatment. So it seems to be that certain machines are designed to heat brood at 42 degrees Celsius for 2 hours, and that will kill the bulk of the mites within a 20-hour span after the treatment, or make them non-reproductive. It puts a heat stress on the mites. The bees seem to tolerate this temperature difference. And yeah, it's recommended that people use machines because you also have to not only control temperature quite tightly, time quite tightly, but also humidity needs to be very tightly controlled. And there might be multiple applications that need to be done throughout the year if this method is one that you're going to look into. Essentially, it's just a tray that Langstroth-sized frames fit in, but those can be adapted with other bars for if you're going to be using a top bar hive or something that, if you have a non-standard hive, there could be a spacer placed in there that would work as a frame rest. And this could be adapted, I would think, to alternative hives quite well. Can be expensive because this is kind of a proprietary technology, but seems quite promising as a tool. So I'm going to talk a bit about wild hives that I've experienced and with Varroa. It wasn't until I came to Australia with my years of beekeeping that I found a hive in a tree. And it was quite a shock to me that was one that people had known about for decades. It was just something that was in the environment and on people's properties, and I thought that was quite magical. They don't exist in New Zealand. They don't exist in Canada. Most wild hives die from Varroa. I found a meta-analysis of wild honeybee populations throughout the world, and in the years where Varroa was active, they showed that there was 0.11 to 5.4 hives per square kilometer. whereas the Australian surveys typically show about 23 to 148 hives per square kilometer. That just goes to show that wild hives are very rare. Once Varroa gets established, Varroa will create essentially an extinction of unmanaged hives, but also thinking about the importance for monitoring. If you live close to an area that is forested, for instance, a state park or anything like that, you could be having that essentially a commercial load of honeybees close to your hive, just in the wild population. 148 hives is no joke in a square kilometer. That's quite a heavy density of beehives. And once they start weakening from Varroa stress, and managed hives, which are doing well because we're taking care of them, go to collect resources from them because they're weakened, they're not able to defend their honey stores anymore. Managed hives are going to be picking up all of those loads of mites. So in the interim, we'll talk about chemical methods as well. So we have two different methods of controlling for the mite. We have synthetic and we have non-synthetic. Typically, people would call them organic methods. And they're produced in different ways. They're usually derived from natural things and just concentrated to be effective. So these are a list of the current treatments that are available. They come in a few different families. So these ones here, they're the same active ingredient. These two here have the same chemical family. It's not the same active ingredient, but they work in the same way. And then we have the two non-synthetic chemicals. So the key message is that all miticides are to be used either within or directly above the brood nest. If you have a Warre hive, for instance, and you have brood that spans 3 or 4 boxes, that brood might have to be condensed just during the treatment period into 2 boxes, let's say, for the treatments to go in and to be concentrated and effective in that period. And every case is going to be a bit different, and it just depends on understanding what's going on in that hive at that time. So like I was saying before, products that I have the same chemical or the same mode of action. They shouldn't be used back to back, and that's just to space out the time that these chemicals are effective before resistance becomes a built-up problem in the mite population. So rotating the chemicals to reduce that chance of resistance is important, and not using more than one thing at one time. Sometimes they have interactions with each other and create a third thing, which we don't know what that will do. It's not well studied. So making sure to always follow the labeled instructions and understanding how these things interact with each other and how they affect the mite is important. Some QR codes about the permit, the labels, and the safety sheets is here. And spend some time talking about the non-synthetic chemicals. So for those at the moment, we have formic acid in the product Formic Pro, and we have thymol essential oil in the product of ApiGuard. So for ApiGuard, it treats just the phoretic mites, so those mites that are on the outside of the brood, and it's temperature dependent, so anything above 15 degrees Celsius where the brood cluster breaks and they want to be hygienic. It's essentially thyme oil that's been refined into its crystal form, and then that crystal is broken down and suspended in a gel. That gel has been put in a tin, and we can put it on top of a beehive. And over the span of a couple of weeks, the bees will clean that up, and the thyme will evaporate, will kill the mite, and after that first 2 weeks, another treatment needs to go in for another 2 weeks. So for the alternative hives, the tin can be quite thick. And so that can be put on a thinner card or on aluminum foil. But it has to be placed above where the brood nest is. So whether that brood nest has to be condensed or figuring out how to do it. If it's a top bar hive, access has to be given to the bees for that area. Otherwise, they're not going to obviously clean it. The hygiene isn't going to be there if they can't actually access it. So, yeah, spaces in the actual top bars might have to be given, and a cover might have to actually be placed on there. But there's lots of different hive styles and lots of different hive variations. So feel free to give me a call if people want to talk about very in-depth specific things for how these can be placed. But those are just kind of the big points. Bees have to get at it, so enough space has to be given for it, and it has to be in and amongst the brood. So for Formic Pro, you have to have an open entrance. I did a little bit of math, figured it has to be above 40 centimeters, but essentially it's 2 strips placed on the hive, again, across the brood area for 7 days. And it has to be within the temperature range. This one's a little bit more tight, of daytime temperature of above 10 degrees and below 30 degrees. Above 10 breaks the cluster, the bees are active. Below 30, the Formic Pro, the formic acid doesn't off gas too quickly. It can knock bees about quite a bit. It's quite a strong organic acid. So if people are using vented bottom boards, those must be covered so that the formic has a chance to actually fill that brood nest area. The vapor is heavier than air, so being placed above the brood nest and allowing the fumes to waft down is important. And if there aren't any gaps between the top bars, small gaps would have to be opened in amongst the top bars to allow the fumes to drop down. The bees don't have to access this one, so the gaps don't have to be too pronounced, but definitely need to make the opening, at least for the 7-day period of this treatment. Again, it has to be placed over the brood area, or the area with the most brood. And the opening of the hive must be about 41 centimeters squared. And that's just to give the bees enough of an area to fan fresh air into the hive, and that cycles the formic acid around. One thing I should mention about that Formic Pro treatment is that it's the only treatment that attacks the mite in the brood as well. Forgot to mention that. So it will do, I heard about 80% of the mite in the brood will be affected by Formic Pro during that 7-day period of treatment. For the synthetic chemicals, we have 2 chemical families that we have to pay attention to. Amitraz is the active ingredient in Apivar and Apitraz, same chemical, 2 different companies. So bouncing between them is not the best idea. And we have fluvalinate and flumethrin, which are pyrethroids, synthetic pyrethroids, and they're produced by Apistan and Baverol, and they function similarly. So Baverol and Apistan contain different ingredients but have the same mode of action. Just pause here for a second. So these are chemicals that you don't want to be using while honey is present. And these are ones that they're incredibly effective against the mite. But again, yeah, you want to be able to either take out the honey, or you want to, at the very least, with a follower board or something, contain it, but ideally taking away as much honey as possible, other than what the bees are currently feeding on during these treatments. Varroa, it's the same mode of action as Apistan, and it can be used with supers. We haven't noticed it's been put into the chemical strip a certain way that it doesn't lift off into the honey. Just have some notes on the actual application of it. It's a bit of an easier one for people to use, and a lot of people are I think leaning on this one. But Amatraz products, again, won't spend too much time harping on about this, but Amatraz products, again, function very similarly. They have to be placed in amongst the brood. Honey shouldn't be on the hive during the time that these treatments are going. And you have to be careful about wax not coming from that brood, obviously, and all that. Amatraz, same family, that Amatraz chemical. And this one also, you can't have honey supers on for 14 days post-treatment removal. So, or honey supers, or even just frames in a top bar, for instance, where they need to be drawing out. You need to give that 14 days of all of the chemical to evaporate out of the hive before any honey collection or honey storage happens. These ones are quite easy for alternative hives to be adapted for because it's just a small gap between top bars in and amongst the brood that needs to be given for these strips to slide in. It's a 6 to 8 week treatment period, so it's a long-term treatment. It's quite safe for bees. There hasn't been much long-term effect that happens on the bees or on the brood. But again, you want to condense the brood. Honey in the areas may have to be removed before the treatment, depending on what treatment, or left on and just understood that all the honey in that area is just going to be left for bee food. And it may honestly be a necessity during this build-up phase while Varroa is going through the wild population, the unmanaged hives, and while we're experiencing this really high level of reinfestation, it gives a bit of a safety net for beekeepers to be able to manage their hives well. So for up-to-date miticide information and for options, this is one of the QR codes that you can scan for that. It should give the up-to-date treatment table. And one of the most important things to do after treatment, again, is to monitor. Once the strips or the formic pads come out, or Apivar or Apiguard has been dealt with in the hive, do another check, see if it worked, see if the mite level is actually come down sufficiently, and if it has, great. Do another check in a month, see if it's risen, if your bees have picked something up from the environment, and yeah, just keep checking, keep records of it, have a little black book, have some method that works for you, so that you know when treatments went in, how long they're going to go in, when they're going to come out, which one you used, and yeah, even what mite levels are at certain areas. One thing that Australia is going to be rolling out is something called the coal loss survey. This is something that's done internationally, and it's just a survey year to year of what colonies losses there were over winter. Oftentimes it's understood that it's from Varroa, but it can be for anything, whether it's by starvation, whether it's by other diseases or pests or natural disaster. That's all collected into the coal loss. This chart here is something that was given to us by the New Zealand Landcare Research, which is the government organization that does data for agriculture. And it's showing here that people who use alternating treatments have the most effect at managing the mites. by what their hive losses percentage is. So the people who have the smallest hive losses are typically people who are able to alternate their treatments. Obviously, this is done for New Zealand. It includes oxalic acid, sadly, which isn't yet for approval. There are a couple of products that are coming down the line, but they're not quite legal to use yet as of this date. So register for coal loss, be a good thing to do. So 4 stages moving ahead for Varroa, making sure your hives are healthy. So regular requeening, replacing old comb, replacing anything that's diseased, making sure that your hives have enough honey, have enough pollen, that they're able to reproduce well, and just regularly checking, monitoring, making sure that the mite hasn't exploded in the hive, and just controlling for every other pest and disease. Doing every check, again, recommended every month or so to be in the hive and doing at least a check for Varroa, checking a couple of brood frames for disease and stress. And yes, a couple of silver linings for Varroa is, we're the last country to get it. So we can learn from overseas experience and mistakes. A lot of countries didn't have so many treatments. Some only had one treatment that was available when Varroa hit their shores, and it quickly became resistant to that treatment because of repeated use. Now we can actually have a few that we can rotate out. It's going to improve the standards of beekeepers, and it's going to really compel beekeepers to communicate with each other and partner with each other to figure out what people are doing in certain areas. I've already heard people talking about what treatments they're going to use in certain areas with bee clubs and whatnot. And there is substantial support from the government in the beekeeping industry and for pollination and all that. And once the feral colonies largely disappear, floral resources are going to be a lot more abundant, but also it will clear out a lot of the lingering other diseases and areas that pests can build up in the wild. So just keep on regularly monitoring, understanding the timings of the various treatments, and making sure that those treatments are being rotated out. Keeping yourself safe from reinfestation really is the big key, and making sure it's not out of whack. Here's some quick QR codes for the various resources we've shared so far. This is the New South Wales Varroa development team. And yeah, this is, again, my phone number. Feel free to give me a call, and we could have a bit of a chat about anything Varroa. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.